Every pope is shown one book, no title, no author, just truth etched in trembling ink. What he reads alone in that silent room changes everything he believes, or destroys it. They say the Vatican Apostolic Archive stretches over 50 miles of shelving, but that's just the part the public is allowed to know about. Somewhere deep beneath the marbled corridors and crimson-draped halls, past checkpoints guarded by Swiss uniforms and silence, there is another vault. No public tours, no photos, no card catalogs. Just a sealed bronze door, older than most nations, and the rule that only the Pope and one other can ever turn the key. And even then, they are warned not to look too long at what's inside. The rumors began centuries ago. Monks scribbled warnings into the margins of illuminated texts. Travelers from the East whispered about golden tablets traded for silence. A Jesuit in the 1700s claimed he found a document written in perfect Latin, signed by someone who did not have a name, only a number, and every so often, the whispers return. A scholar disappears. A shipment arrives at night under escort. A scribe faints in the reading room, mumbling about the ones who wait in the dark between stars. It is not the size of the archive that disturbs people. It is what has been found inside, letters written on materials that do not burn, star maps etched onto obsidian glass, showing constellations no telescope has ever recorded, and a sealed codex known only as Annuntiatio Lux, the announcement of light. Its pages are unreadable to most, not because the language is dead, but because it is not human. Some say the Vatican was never just a spiritual authority. It was a receiver, a lighthouse, chosen long ago by something else, not to spread faith but to protect a message that had not yet arrived. And when it did, in the early months of 1947, it came not by courier or messenger. It came as a signal, a pattern of sounds encoded in prime numbers. It lasted for exactly 13 minutes. It ended with coordinates, then silence. The United States tracked it. Russia did too, but the signal was not for them. It was directed straight at the Holy See. The Pope at the time, Pius XII, received a private briefing. The transcript of that meeting, if it exists, is said to be locked in a lead-lined case, deeper than the archive, behind a door that requires not one key, but 2 fingerprints. The archivists who work near it say the air grows cold near that section, even in summer. One man claimed his watch stopped whenever he passed it. Another refused to return to the chamber at all, saying he saw his reflection blink twice when he only blinked once. And still, no one speaks of it, not on record, because if the rumors are true, if the Vatican has been guarding something for longer than the Church has existed, then the real question isn't what's in the archive. It's what happens when it wants to be found. High on a dry mountain in southeastern Arizona, where the sky stays black and clean, the Vatican quietly watches the stars. Far from Rome, far from stained glass and incense, there is a telescope so powerful it can see the flicker of distant worlds orbiting suns light years away. It does not belong to NASA. It does not belong to any government. It belongs to the Vatican. And one of its most advanced instruments, funded through a partnership most people have never heard of, goes by a name that still sparks unease: LUCIFER. The acronym stands for Large Binocular Telescope, Near Infrared Utility, with Camera and Integral Field Unit for Extragalactic Research. But those who work closest to it say the name was not chosen by accident. Jesuit astronomers, some of the most brilliant minds in their field, have long claimed the Church's role in science is misunderstood. They say it is not about denying truth but guarding it, and sometimes preparing the faithful for truths that shake the very floor beneath the altar. The Vatican Observatory has existed in some form since the 16th century, but in the late 20th century, a decision was made to expand, not in Rome, not in Europe, but in the desert of the American Southwest, where visibility would be uninterrupted, and curiosity could stretch beyond theological boundaries. They built their new observatory on Mount Graham on land some indigenous tribes consider sacred. Controversy followed, but the construction continued. The goal, they said, was simple: to search for life. But what kind of life? One Vatican astronomer once hinted during a rare interview that we may soon need to baptize aliens. Another went further, saying the possibility of intelligent non-human life did not contradict church teachings at all. "We are not alone," he said, "and we never have been." Those words were not spoken lightly, especially not in the shadow of a telescope named for the light-bearer. Some speculate that the Church, long accused of suppressing scientific progress, has actually been one of its quietest accelerators, that they have known something for centuries, something that is now approaching. The LUCIFER instrument scans in infrared. It sees heat, not light. And according to leaked internal notes from a Jesuit-run meeting in the early 2000s, it was tasked with tracking anomalous objects exhibiting non-Keplerian motion. In other words, things that do not move like comets or planets, things that change direction, things that respond. The name LUCIFER might be a smokescreen, or it might be a signal, because for the Vatican keepers of prophecy, mystery, and fear, the greatest heresy may not be denying God. It may be admitting that something else was already watching before God was named. In hushed corners of old Rome, there are whispers of a telescope that was never meant to look outward, not in the traditional sense. Project Silo, as it is rumored to be called, was not built for astronomy. It was built for confirmation, quietly commissioned through Vatican-linked scientific channels during the 1980s. Its purpose was veiled even from those who assembled its components. The lens array, they were told, was intended for exoplanet studies. But the final positioning told another story entirely. Siloé, named after the pool where the blind were said to receive their sight, was not mounted in Arizona, or Chile, or anywhere light pollution could interrupt its gaze. It was built off-world, aboard a satellite platform launched in cooperation with unnamed foreign partners, possibly France, possibly something even more discreet. Its orientation was not toward the outer spiral arms of the galaxy, not toward known constellations. It was aimed inward, at something dark, something silent, something moving fast. There is no official record of Project Siloé, no budget line, no press release. But in 1993, a Jesuit priest visiting a conference in Switzerland made an offhand remark about the eye we placed between earth and heaven. He never clarified. 3 months later, he died in a fire the police called accidental. The flames reportedly burned hot enough to fuse metal with bone. For those who still believe in the project's existence, one detail remains consistent. Siloé's true target was never a star system. It was an object, cold, non-reflective, and accelerating. There are rumors unconfirmed, of course, that the data collected was hand-delivered to the Vatican, not transmitted, not stored on networked servers, carried by a man who had not slept in 3 days, eyes bloodshot, fingers trembling. His report, said to be a combination of thermal readings and gravitational anomalies, ended with a single Latin phrase: "Intelligens, sed alienum." It thinks, but it is not one of us. From that moment, Project Siloé vanished. No more briefings, no more murmurs. But shortly after, new protocols were introduced within the Vatican Observatory, classified sighting logs, increased security, and private theological meetings on what it would mean if intelligence had arrived, not from the stars, but from the dark between them. Some claim that Siloé saw more than just movement, that it witnessed structure, shape, an object that pulsed, not mechanically but rhythmically, like breath, like waiting. And it was not just heading for Earth, it was watching Earth slow down to meet it. The Vatican never confirmed these reports. They never denied them, either. Because the most powerful telescope is not the one that looks far. It is the one that looks back. Father Malachi Martin had the kind of eyes that made even other priests fall silent. Not because they were cruel or cold, but because they were tired. Tired in a way that only comes from seeing something the soul was never meant to hold. In the late 1960s, he left the Vatican under vague circumstances. Officially, it was to pursue writing. Unofficially, it was because he had seen a file. He never named it, only said it was sealed. Sealed in red wax, marked with the papal crest, and handed to him by a cardinal who whispered, "Read this, then forget it." But he never did forget. In interviews, Father Malachi hinted at things most dismissed as metaphor. He spoke of a spiritual war beyond the veil, and a false message from the heavens. But there was one phrase he returned to, again and again, always with a tremor in his voice. The great deception. To the untrained ear, it sounded apocalyptic, poetic, but to those who had worked alongside him in Rome, it was code, a warning. He wasn't talking about metaphorical darkness. He was talking about something real, something on its way, and he did not believe it came from God. In a radio interview recorded in the late 1990s, just a few years before his death, he slipped. The host asked him about the Vatican's knowledge of extraterrestrial life. Father Malachi paused, then said, "They know. What's approaching is not friendly." When asked if it was a comet, he laughed softly. "If only," he replied. "No, this is not rock and ice. This is attentive." He later claimed it had already been seen by advanced instruments, and that the Church had known about it since at least the early 1950s. Not because they found it, but because it found them. A few pages from his personal journals, now locked away by private collectors, reportedly describe dreams in which a vast black eye hovered above the earth, never blinking, never sleeping, just watching. He said it had no face, no sound, but when it turned its attention to you, your thoughts were no longer your own. Some dismissed his warnings as paranoia. Others said he suffered from mental decline. But in the final months of his life, Father Malachi gave one last interview. He was visibly ill, voice thin, hands shaking. And yet, when he spoke, there was no hesitation. "It is not a comet," he said, "and it will not announce itself with fire or light. It will whisper, it will promise, and the world will listen." He died in 1999 after what was reported as a fall in his apartment. Friends claimed he had been frightened in the days before, checking the locks, sleeping fully clothed, windows sealed. On his bedside table was a Bible, and tucked inside it a note written in his hand. "Deception comes cloaked in wonder. Tell them, before it speaks in their dreams." He tried to warn us, but warnings are only useful if we understand what's speaking through them. In the summer of 1947, the world changed. Not in the ways people expected. There was no war, no quake, no eruption, just a crash in the New Mexico desert. A few broken fragments, a weather balloon story, and a silence that stretched deeper than any crater. But what most people never knew was that while the United States scrambled to cover what it had recovered from Roswell, something else arrived, not in a wreck, in a whisper. The message was short, 12 tones, repeated 3 times, then a pause, then a burst of encoded symbols that, when translated, did not match any known Earth language but carried a structure eerily similar to Aramaic. The signal did not go to military towers or academic observatories. It was intercepted by a listening post operated by a little-known division of the Vatican's Internal Intelligence Service. Based in the hills of Castel Gandolfo, the report was hand-delivered to Pope Pius XII that same night. He read it twice, once in Latin, once in silence. What followed was never made public. No press release, no Vatican bulletin. But records show the Pope immediately summoned 3 individuals: the head of the Jesuit order, a linguist specializing in pre-biblical languages, and a man whose name appears nowhere else in Vatican history. A footnote in a forgotten ledger refers to him only as Custos Lux, the Keeper of Light. Together, they retreated into the private archives for 11 hours. When they emerged, the Pope did not speak to the press for nearly a week, but Vatican radio, for reasons no one explained, went completely silent during that entire time. Not a hymn, not a sermon, just static. The message, according to those who claim to have seen it, was not a warning, it was not a threat. It was a question, directed not at presidents, nor at kings, but at the Church itself. Are you ready to remember? Pope Pius never answered publicly, but 2 months later, he issued a decree reinforcing the doctrine of original sin, subtly altering its phrasing to allow for the possibility that the fall of man did not begin on earth. Theologians debated it for years. Most never saw the connection, but the Jesuits did. Shortly after the decree, new appointments were made at the Vatican Observatory. Funding increased. A classified theological commission was formed to re-examine non-canonical texts, especially those referencing watchers, messengers, and beings that descended in brightness but not in glory. By the time the world returned to its Cold War distractions, the Vatican had already begun preparing, not for contact, but for the return of something it believed had never left. The question remains, why the papacy? Why not world governments or scientific communities? Because the message was not about discovery. It was about memory, buried memory, and the ones who never forgot. Long before the first cross was carved in wood, before scripture was inked on parchment, the ones who came may have chosen their messenger. And in 1947, they asked him if he still remembered who they were. In the late 1950s, under the fluorescent hum of a secured briefing room somewhere beneath Washington, D.C., a meeting took place that officially never happened. The man who entered wore white, not military white, papal white. He was not alone. 2 aides flanked him. One was a Jesuit. The other was silent the entire time, never writing, never blinking. The Americans in the room referred to themselves only as consultants. But later, documents, half redacted and stamped in red, would refer to them by another name, the Majestic 12. According to a declassified memo buried in a sea of technical jargon, the Vatican had been invited to observe certain developments in non-terrestrial research, not because of diplomacy, not because of science, but because, as one line chillingly states, the meeting was brief, under 2 hours, but what was shared changed everything. The consultants' men tied to aerospace defense, atomic research, and psychological warfare presented the Pope with what they called biological data of non-human origin. What exactly he was shown remains unknown. But the term used in the memo was not alien. It was pre-terrestrial, as if the beings in question had been here long before any government, any flag, any prayer. At one point, according to the notes, the Pope asked only one question: what do they believe in? The answer was never written down. Following the meeting, Vatican intelligence protocols were updated. A new theological subcommittee was established under total secrecy, tasked not with debating doctrine but with preparing for potential reinterpretation, not just of Genesis, but of Revelation. For their part, the Americans remained stone-faced. They needed the Vatican not because of what it knew, but because of how it was trusted. The Church, they believed, could control the narrative, could soften the blow if when the truth began to leak. The Pope, however, made no promises. 3 months later, back in Rome, he summoned several archivists and requested documents not touched in over 400 years. Manuscripts sealed after the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Writings once deemed apocryphal, dangerous, heretical. Among them, a scroll translated from ancient Greek containing a single phrase repeated throughout. They came before language. The Majestic 12, if they ever truly existed, are now scattered ghosts of bureaucracy, their records scrubbed, their operations buried. But the Vatican? The Vatican never forgets. It absorbs. It waits. And some believe that meeting in Washington was not the first contact between church and phenomenon. It was just the first time both sides admitted it, out loud. What does it mean when faith and fear sit at the same table? When men in robes and men in suits both look to the sky and lower their heads? Perhaps the real secret is not what they saw, but what they recognized. In 1917, 3 children stood in a Portuguese field and claimed to see a lady made of light. She spoke without moving her lips. She shimmered in the sunless air. And over the course of 6 apparitions, she gave them 3 secrets. The first 2 were revealed quickly, visions of hell, of war, of suffering. But the third, that one was hidden, locked in a sealed envelope, hand-delivered to the Vatican, where it remained untouched by daylight for more than 60 years. When the third secret of Fatima was finally revealed to the world in the year 2000, it was met not with awe, but with confusion. The text described a bishop dressed in white walking through a ruined city of corpses, only to be struck down by bullets and arrows. A scene of martyrdom, yes, but also metaphor. And to many, it felt wrong, incomplete, sanitized. Because according to handwritten notes smuggled out by a Vatican insider in the late 1970s, the original secret was longer, much longer, and far stranger. In that version, never officially acknowledged, the children were shown a door in the sky and figures not shaped like men, yet brighter than angels. One child, Lucia, wrote that the lady warned of a deception so beautiful it would confuse even the faithful. Another described a silent wheel of eyes descending without sound, and when one of the children asked where these beings came from, the lady's answer was chilling: from where your prayers cannot reach. Lucia lived the longest. She became a nun, cloistered in silence, but before her death, she wrote a final letter, one that has never been released. Some believe it confirms the secret was not about earthly war or papal assassination. It was about contact, not just with what is above, but with what waits just beyond the veil of light and shadow. The Vatican's official explanation was carefully worded. They called it a symbolic warning. They said the third secret had already been fulfilled, pointing to the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II in 1981. But those who had studied the original testimonies knew better. The children of Fatima had never mentioned a pope being shot. They had never described guns. Their fear was different. It was awe wrapped in dread. Some researchers believe the vision was not prophecy at all. It was memory, a suppressed, ancestral memory of an encounter not in the future, but in the deep, unrecorded past. Passed down through DNA, through whispers in dream, triggered again by presence. Triggered again when something once familiar returns. Because sometimes a secret is not hidden to protect the world from terror. Sometimes it is buried because the truth is too vast, too alien, too holy and horrifying all at once. And the children? They were never chosen to see. They were chosen to remind. In the earliest scrolls, before councils convened and creeds were carved in stone, the descriptions were raw, unfiltered, strange. The beings who appeared to the prophets did not look like men with feathers and halos. They arrived in clouds that burned, wheels of fire, voices like rushing waters. They didn't descend, they landed. They didn't comfort, they commanded. And somewhere between the Aramaic and the Latin, between the parchment and the pulpit, those beings were renamed angels, but in the shadows of the Vatican library, tucked behind locked folios and faded ink, are older versions, translations that were never meant for public eyes. In those, the wings are not feathery but metallic. The light is not divine, it pulses. And the beings, they do not hover. They hover above the ground, as if held aloft by something unseen, humming. During the late 1970s, a quiet revision effort was launched within certain circles of Vatican theology. It was never announced. There were no headlines, just small edits, phrase by phrase. Heavenly host became celestial presence. chariot of God was softened to radiant form, and most notably, the word kavod, once used to describe the fiery glory that descended on Mount Sinai, was footnoted with an alternative, vehicle. A vehicle. Some within the church called it linguistic integrity. Others called it preparation. A Vatican linguist, who left the order in the early 1990s, later confessed that he had been assigned to study patterns in divine appearances across both testaments. He was asked to look for consistency of craft. He didn't understand at first, but then he noticed. The beings always came down, never up. They always emitted sound before speech. And they always demanded that the witnesses not be afraid. He was told not to pursue those connections. He did, anyway, and what he found changed him. He concluded that many of the so-called angelic encounters could be better described as contact experiences, controlled descent, glowing forms, technology disguised as transcendence. He presented his findings to a subcommittee within the Jesuit Scientific Division. They thanked him, then reassigned him to a monastery, remote, isolated, no research privileges. He left the church the following year. Today, in the most widely used Bibles, the stories remain: the burning bush, the pillar of fire, the cloud that guided by day and glowed at night. But no one asks how a cloud knows where to go. No one asks why a voice from heaven always needed a mountain, a flame, or a wheel to be heard. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the wings were never wrong. Maybe they were just misunderstood. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first mistranslation the church was told to make. Not to hide a lie, but to delay a truth. Because the difference between an angel and something else entirely is only a matter of description. Operation Gabriel did not exist on paper. No funding record. No public announcement. Just a name passed like a whisper between intelligence handlers and cloistered technicians, between men in collars and men with clearance. Gabriel, the messenger. Gabriel, the voice. But what this operation listened for was not prophecy. It was signal. The first station came online in the early 1960s, hidden deep in the Andes, masked as a meteorological outpost. On the surface, it measured wind patterns. Beneath the surface, it hosted an array of exotic receivers, frequencies so narrow they bypassed commercial interference entirely. The Vatican had partnered with unnamed third parties, possibly remnants of wartime scientific units, to build something no nation dared fund publicly: a net to catch whispers from the stars. But according to those who claim to have worked on it, the most interesting signals didn't come from above. They came laterally, low-altitude bursts, pulses that skimmed the atmosphere like stones across water, triangulated from nowhere, or worse, everywhere, as if the source was moving, fast, silent, and circling. 2 more stations were built in the following decades. One in the Congo Basin, disguised as a wildlife sanctuary. The other along the wind-swept ice of Antarctica, where cold could preserve both equipment and secrets. These were not large facilities: a few researchers, a few priests, 1 satellite uplink, and a silence so deep it rang. The logs, what little of them have been leaked, suggest something anomalous was heard at least 3 times between 1968 and 1979. The transmissions were short, uncoded, but structured. Not static, not natural. Something in the rhythm betrayed intention. One Vatican technician, before vanishing in the early 1980s, reportedly described one of the signals as a litany with no words. He said it hummed like breath caught in a cathedral, said it knew when you were listening. In response, the Vatican created a theological review board, not to evaluate belief but to prepare language. If contact occurred, if comprehension failed, they would need scripture that could bend without breaking, doctrine that could absorb anomaly, and some voice to stand at the pulpit and say, "We knew." Operation Gabriel was never decommissioned. It simply faded, its stations abandoned, buried, or, some say, still active, operating autonomously, waiting for the next whisper. Because these weren't radios. They were ears. Holy ears. And the question was never if something out there would speak. The question was, what would it say when it realized someone was finally listening back? It was the winter of 1965 when the signal came, crisp, unmodulated, and completely out of place. Inside a small Vatican-affiliated monitoring room just outside Castel Gandolfo, a technician named Pietro Allegri leaned forward, headphones pressed tight, brow furrowed. He had been scanning for atmospheric interference routine maintenance on a quiet afternoon. But what he caught was not noise. It was a pulse, slow, measured, repeating in intervals too precise to be natural. He switched dials, adjusted the antenna array, and narrowed the band. Still there, still steady, and moving. He charted the signal's path over several hours and realized it was in polar orbit, not geostationary, not elliptical, polar. It looped around the Earth vertically, from pole to pole, something no nation had admitted achieving at that time. The Soviets hadn't done it, the Americans hadn't announced it, and yet, something was already there. The Vatican, though mostly silent on its involvement with space monitoring, kept certain unofficial listening posts throughout Europe, many hidden under the guise of radio astronomy or atmospheric research. That day, all of them confirmed the same thing. The object was real, and it was transmitting. Pietro logged everything: frequency, pattern, orbital path. He sent the data up the chain to Jesuit superiors, to the observatory, and finally to a small group within the Secretariat of State. No public report was made, no explanation given, but 2 days later, his lab was emptied, his tapes were taken, and Pietro Allegri was reassigned, not to another lab, to a monastery. He never operated a radio again, but the mystery lingered. Years later, after his death, a sealed letter was found among his belongings. In it, he described the transmission in detail. He believed it was not a message, but a test, a calibration. As if the object in orbit was adjusting itself, aligning with something unseen. He wrote that the signal was too clean to be accidental, too quiet to be a beacon. He called it a breath being held. Curiously, the Vatican Observatory's funding increased in the years following the event. New instruments, new staff, and a quiet partnership with European space agencies under the banner of joint exploration. But there were whispers among archivists, among technicians, that the Holy See had been watching not just the heavens, but what moved between them. The polar object, whatever it was, continued transmitting intermittently for over a year. Then, without fanfare, it stopped. No crash, no burn-up, no known retrieval, just silence. Some call it the Black Night, others call it a ghost satellite. But those closest to the Church's shadow network have another name for it: Custos Caeli, the Watcher of the Skies. They believe it was not launched. They believe it was left. And the question no one can answer is chilling. Was it waiting for us to find it, or waiting for someone else to return? Deep beneath the Vatican, beyond the gilded chapels and marble halls, there are older rooms, damp, narrow corridors carved when Rome still whispered in Latin, and bones were stored like scripture. This is where the catacombs stretch, not the ones shown on pilgrim tours, but the forbidden ones. And in one of those sealed crypts, resting behind a wrought iron gate long since rusted shut, is something the Church stopped cataloging in the 18th century: a skull, but not one shaped by any human hand or birth. No records explain how it arrived. No cardinal ever signed for its transfer. Yet there it sits, nestled inside a velvet-lined ossuary box marked only with a faded crest, 3 keys, crossed, and a star above. Not the Star of Bethlehem, a different star, one with 8 points. The skull is long, too long, not merely elongated like those found in ancient cultures that practiced cranial binding. This one is smooth, symmetrical, and untouched by compression. There are no binding lines, no ridges, no trauma. The cranium curves back nearly twice the length of an average human skull, and most telling of all, there is no coronal suture. The line that separates the two frontal bones in all human children, later fusing in adulthood, is simply missing. It is not deformed. It is something else. For centuries, the artifact remained untouched, locked away during the chaotic years of Enlightenment when science and faith clashed in whispers behind closed doors. There is mention of it only once in the Vatican's private ledger, a single line written in Latin, dated 1753, non de terra, not of earth. In the mid-1960s, during a brief recataloguing effort, a young archivist stumbled across the ossuary. He took photos, notes, measurements. Days later, his documents were seized. He was offered a promotion to a remote post in northern Canada, far from the vaults of Rome. He accepted. No one ever spoke of the skull again, at least not officially, but among those who work in the deeper levels of the archive, stories still circulate. Some claim that the Vatican once commissioned a genetic analysis in secret, that the results came back with no matches, not with humans, not with primates, not with anything preserved in Earth's fossil record. Others say the skull was never meant to be found, that it had been placed there, or left behind. Perhaps it was a relic, or a warning. What remains chilling is this. Several ancient texts, long suppressed by church authority, describe visitations by beings who wore no helmets, but whose heads glowed in the dark, elongated and pale like lanterns. They were mistaken for angels, or perhaps remembered that way because it was easier. And if one of them died here, long ago, and was buried among us, then someone in the church knew, and chose silence, not because they doubted what it was, but because they were waiting for the day when someone else would arrive, looking for what was theirs. It began with a courier, a diplomatic pouch, unmarked, delivered by hand to the Apostolic Palace in early September of the year 1978. Inside was a dossier not from an embassy, not from intelligence services, but from a private archaeological group operating in the Iraqi desert. What they had found had no name, only coordinates. A sealed chamber buried beneath sand and basalt, untouched for millennia, and inside it, a figure, not a statue, not a carving, a preserved form, thin, tall, arms longer than they should have been, skull slightly luminous under certain conditions, no nose, no lips, eyes sealed but elongated like the head of a mantis, except smooth, as if molded by heat and not born. It had not decayed, it had simply stopped. What followed was chaos. The Vatican had agents embedded across the world, scientific observers, cloaked as clergy, archivists who spoke 10 languages but signed no passports. One of them had been present when the chamber was breached. He sent the report straight to Rome. It landed on the desk of the newly elected Pope John Paul I. He read it, twice, then called for a private meeting. Only 3 men were present: the Pope, the Secretary of State, and the Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The transcript, if one exists, has never surfaced. But according to Vatican insiders who spoke decades later under anonymity, the Pope was visibly shaken. He asked one question over and over: what if it is not a demon? The answer, no matter how they phrased it, did not satisfy him. He refused to condemn the discovery. He refused to classify it as evil. He wanted more time, more study, more light. That light never came. 33 days after ascending to the papacy, Pope John Paul I was found dead in his chambers, slumped in bed, reading glasses still on, a book of devotional poems on his chest. The cause was listed as a heart attack. No autopsy was ever performed. No medical examiner from outside the Vatican was allowed to investigate. He was buried quickly, quietly, with only a handful of high-ranking cardinals allowed near the body. The chamber in Iraq, sealed, bulldozed, covered again in sand. A military zone now, nothing to see. But something had changed. Within weeks, new policies were enacted in the Vatican archives. Classified access was reduced, cross-communication between observatories restricted, and a new division created within the Curia. Its function? Spiritual defense, not against sin, but against information. Because the Church had seen something, and one man at the very top asked a dangerous question. What if this was not evil? What if this was first? Some say he died of a broken heart. Others whisper that his death was necessary. That faith must not ask questions it cannot bear to hear answered. Because sometimes the greatest heresy is wonder. She lived in silence, behind the stone walls of a Carmelite convent nestled in the Apennine Hills. Her name was Sister Benedetta, and by all accounts, she was gentle, obedient, a woman of still prayers and quiet devotion. She had taken her vows at just 18 years old, and by the time she saw the figure, she had not spoken to anyone outside the order in more than 20 years. The vision came in the spring of 1908, during the 4th week of Lent. She had just finished her midnight prayers and was returning to her cell when she saw it standing at the far end of the corridor, tall, robed, motionless. At first, she thought it was the confessor. A priest from Rome had arrived that morning to hear the sisters' yearly admissions. But as she stepped closer, something felt wrong. The air around the figure was still. Too still. No sound, no rustle, no breath, just a presence. She stopped only 10 paces away. The figure wore the garments of a priest, but the face was smooth. No age, no beard, no lines. Just skin like wax, and eyes that were black, utterly black, not reflective, not wet. She later wrote that they did not seem to see her, but rather observe her, the way a telescope watches the stars, not with intent, but with precision. Then, in a voice that came not through the ears but through the chest, it spoke. One sentence. Do not be afraid when the silence breaks open. She dropped to her knees, prayed, cried. When she looked up, the corridor was empty. The door at the end was still closed. No one else stirred. The next morning, she wrote a letter, not to her abbess, not to Rome, but to the bishop who had once baptized her, long ago, in her village. In the letter, she described the being. She said it stood in the shape of a priest but did not breathe. She wrote that she felt as if it had always been there, but only chose that night to be seen. She asked only one thing in her letter. If it returns, will I be allowed to listen? The letter was never published, never archived, but it is referenced just once in a footnote inside a restricted Vatican catalog from 1937. The entry lists only her name, the convent, and the phrase eventum inter angelis et humana figura, non approbata, an event between an angel and a human form not approved. The convent burned in 1943. Allied bombers mistook it for a signal post. The archives were lost, or so the official history goes. But one surviving sister, decades later, said she remembered the night it happened, not because of the vision, but because every bell in the monastery rang at once, though no rope was pulled. And above the flames, she swore she saw something moving, not flying, just watching, from the sky, waiting for the silence to break. It began with a whisper, not in Latin, not in Aramaic, but in something older, so old it cracked the radios used to record it. In the early 1990s, a series of Vatican-monitored exorcisms began to take a strange turn. The afflicted would sometimes speak in tongues, as was expected, but occasionally, those tongues bore resemblance not to known demonic patterns, but to extinct human languages, specifically Sumerian and Akkadian. The syllables came in fragments, broken, rasped through shredded vocal cords. But when transcribed, scholars noticed a chilling pattern. They weren't curses. They were instructions, not screams of torment, but sentences, ritual commands, phrases about gates, openings, stars. The Vatican's Office of Exorcisms initially dismissed the incidents as linguistic mimicry, possessed individuals unconsciously echoing phrases they'd heard in forgotten documentaries or dusty books. But then came the case in Palermo, A young seminarian, unread, untraveled, shouted the name of a Sumerian god that had not appeared in any academic texts until months after his outburst. He should not have known it, and yet he spoke it with perfect grammar. That was when the church changed its training, silently, without announcement, without press. By 1993, all new exorcists were required to complete a primer in ancient Mesopotamian languages. Not fluency, just recognition, a whisper here, a phrase there. Enough to understand if what they were hearing was not infernal, but primordial. Some resisted. They said it was unnecessary, a waste of time. Others, the ones who had heard it themselves, did not argue. One Jesuit, Father Ronaldo, who had performed over 60 rites, claimed that during his last session, the entity inside the possessed child spoke in monotone, no growl, no scream, and recited a list of star positions, not constellations, coordinates, the kind used in astronomy, the kind used by tracking satellites. The exorcism failed. The boy disappeared 1 month later. In one internal memo, later leaked in fragments, a Vatican linguist wrote that what they were dealing with was not demonic in the classical sense. He used another word, pre-Adamic, a reference to something before Eden, before the fall, before the known. Because demons, as the church had always taught, were once angels, but what if something else was here first? And what if they never fell? Because they never bowed. The protocols remain, quietly taught, never written into the official doctrine. Exorcists are told to listen not just for the rage and blasphemy, but for the ancientness of a voice, the wrong rhythm, the wrong verbs, the wrong age, because some things pretend to be demons, and some things never needed to pretend. They were already waiting, long before the serpent, long before the garden, and maybe long before us. It sits high on Mount Graham, surrounded by desert silence and watched only by the sky. The Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, quiet, white, modern, built far from Rome, nestled in the Arizona wilderness. Officially, it was meant for deep sky observation, a collaboration with American astronomers, and a symbol of the church's harmony with science. But not everyone believed that. From the beginning, whispers followed it. Some said it had nothing to do with distant galaxies, that its true target was something far closer, something hiding. And when a memo surfaced briefly, anonymously, then scrubbed, it changed the shape of those whispers. The memo was short, just a few lines. Target remains obscured at Lagrange position. Continuity of signal stable. No stellar background interference. The phrase Lagrange position stood out specifically, the one behind the moon, a gravitational shadow where objects can sit, hidden from Earth, motionless, waiting. Someone at the Vatican was watching that shadow. A Jesuit astronomer, who later left the order, claimed in a radio interview that the observatory's true function had nothing to do with cataloging stars. He said its mirrors were tuned not for light but for specific thermal patterns, signals, fluctuations that did not behave like natural bodies. He said they were tracking an object that never emitted light but occasionally blocked it, an object that did not reflect solar radiation, something darker than black. And it was not drifting. It was stationary. The official story never changed. The Vatican issued no response. But researchers who dug deeper noticed an unusual pattern. Data from the Arizona Observatory was never made public in full. Unlike other telescopes, its raw readings were stored privately. Access required clerical clearance. Even partner universities could only view curated segments. What were they afraid someone might see? One technician, hired to maintain the servers in the early 2000s, said the system flagged one data string repeatedly over the course of 3 months. A rhythmic interruption, not random, not noise, something that pulsed at regular intervals, as if encoded. He wasn't allowed to copy the logs. His contract ended that spring, and then there was the camera blackout. For 1 hour on a moonless night, all internal monitors at the observatory went dark. Not from a power failure, not from error. A full systems pause. When the screens returned, the star charts were unchanged, but one coordinate, deep in the Lagrange field, had shifted. Just a fraction, but enough to prove motion. Since then, that coordinate has never been seen again. The field was masked, algorithmically scrubbed from routine sweeps. Some astronomers call it a glitch. Others call it protection. Because if something was hiding behind the moon, and the Vatican knew, then perhaps it wasn't a secret they were keeping from us. Perhaps it was a secret they were protecting, not because we were in danger, but because whoever placed it there hadn't finished watching. He was only 33 years old, a Vatican Swiss guard, clean record, respected by his peers, never disciplined. His name was Matteo, and he had stood watch beneath the great dome of St. Peter's for nearly 6 years. The hours were long, the shifts solitary, but he liked it that way. Quiet gave him time to think, until one night in the spring of 2003, when something changed. It was just past 3 in the morning. Rain had been falling steadily over Rome. The city slept. Inside the basilica, the motion sensors remained silent. No doors opened, no windows triggered. And yet, when the morning guard arrived, they found Matteo slumped near the center of the nave, his body folded as if kneeling, blood seeping through the marble cracks beneath the dome. There was no weapon, no sign of a struggle, only a note. 3 words, written in pencil on the back of a printed sermon. They are listening. The official statement came quickly. Suicide, mental stress, no further investigation required. But others inside the Vatican weren't so sure. The security footage from that night, normally backed up to a triple-locked server, was missing. Not corrupted, not damaged, just gone. And not just from the central archive. Even the backup drive, kept in a secure vault beneath the Secretariat, had been wiped. No record remained of the previous 6 hours. And then came the questions. Why was Matteo stationed beneath the dome that night? That post had not been scheduled. He had swapped shifts with another guard earlier in the day. No one could say why. Why had he entered the restricted chamber just minutes before the cameras went dark? That room directly beneath the dome's apex was used only for maintenance. And yet, his access card had been swiped. Twice. And why, hours before his death, had he attempted to contact an astronomer affiliated with the Vatican Observatory? That call was never answered. There is another detail, one that never made it into the official report. A priest, visiting from Argentina, claimed he was praying in one of the side chapels that night when he heard something. Not a scream, not footsteps, but a low, humming tone, like metal under pressure. It vibrated the walls. He said the candles trembled in their holders. And then the sound vanished. When he emerged, the basilica was empty. But later, when he saw Matteo's photograph on the news, he recognized the face. That boy, he said, was looking up, not in fear, but like he finally saw who was speaking. To this day, no other deaths like it have been reported inside the Vatican. But the cameras beneath the dome are never turned off now, and every Swiss guard is warned during training never swap posts without written approval. Not because of protocol, but because of what Matteo may have seen when he looked up, and what might have been staring back. Listening. It has no title, no known author, no date. Just a tight roll of parchment, darker than the rest, kept sealed in a lead-lined tube within the Vatican's secret archives. Some say it was discovered in the 17th century, smuggled from a collapsed monastery somewhere near the Carpathians. Others claim it never came from Earth at all. What is agreed upon is this: the manuscript cannot be read. Its pages, more than 40 in total, are covered in tight, spiraling script. Characters unlike any alphabet known to history. Not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew, not Sumerian. Curves and spikes. Some mirrored, some shaped like eyes, some like keys. The spacing is regular, the lines symmetrical. But no one could match them to anything in human history. For over 300 years, it was deemed gibberish, a hoax, an apocryphal artifact meant to deceive or disturb. Then, in 2017, something changed. A Jesuit linguist, Father Leone, working in partnership with a private research group, fed the manuscript into a machine learning model trained on ancient and undeciphered languages. He wasn't expecting results, just a pattern, a rhythm. But the algorithm didn't reject the text. It paused, and then it categorized it. The manuscript had structure, not just random symbols, but grammar, syntax, frequency distributions too precise to be accidental. It followed rules. It was a language. The AI, in its initial pass, translated only one phrase: "We came before your cities." No context, no verbs, just that sentence, repeated 4 times across the first 3 pages. The team was stunned. When they tried to replicate the result, the model failed. Other systems refused to see the structure. Only the original instance run on a now decommissioned server in Rome produced the phrase. Father Leone, shaken, wrote a single note to the Secretariat. If the message is real, it predates Genesis. Shortly after, his research was halted. The manuscript removed from his custody. He was reassigned to a teaching role in a remote seminary. All public mentions of the manuscript vanished from church records. But in one interview, given off the record before his silence, he said something else. That the full phrase had continued. Not just, "We came before your cities," but, "We came before your cities, and we watched your fires from beneath the stone." He wouldn't explain what that meant, only that he no longer believed the manuscript was meant to be read by us. It wasn't addressed to humanity, he said. It was addressed to those who remember. The Vatican has never acknowledged the document's existence, and perhaps that's for the best. Because if the manuscript truly speaks of something that stood beneath the earth before our first cities burned bright, then whatever wrote it is still waiting for us to listen. They brought it in under the cover of war winter of 1943, smuggled through the ruins of a collapsing Berlin. A small cube, no larger than a chalice, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed inside a lead-lined crate. It had been discovered beneath a collapsed church, tucked behind the altar where no altar should have been, surrounded by stone that bore no Christian marks. The Vatican did not disclose where it came from, only that it arrived, and that no one was to touch it. They placed it in a sub-basement beneath Castel Gandolfo, not far from the summer papal residence. Not because it was holy, but because it was not. The object did not respond to heat, cold, or pressure. Its surface was smooth, but neither metal nor stone. When struck, it rang like glass, but the sound kept going, echoing without end. The priests assigned to monitor it were instructed not to pray in its presence. And then came the light. One night in the summer of 1946, a low pulse filled the chamber, dim at first, like moonlight underwater, then sharper, brighter. The object glowed from within, casting shadows that didn't match the walls. Cameras malfunctioned. Watches stopped. One assistant collapsed. His blood turned the color of rust. That was when Cardinal Belloro insisted on seeing it for himself. A scholar of theology and physics, Belloro had long believed that divine truths could be measured. He demanded access. The request was granted. For 73 minutes, he was alone with the cube. When the guards opened the door again, they found him slumped against the far wall, eyes open, tears staining his face. He was not dead. He was not unconscious. He was still, unblinking, and completely blind. He spoke only once after that. "It unfolded," he whispered. "And I saw, not time, not space. I saw what waits." He died 12 days later. No autopsy was performed. The cube was moved. Some say it now resides beneath the Vatican Library, deeper than the secret archives, behind a vault that opens only to retinal scan and a ring worn by just one man. Others say it was buried beneath the sands of the Sinai, where it first appeared long before the world called them miracles. But there are whispers, dangerous ones, that the cube is not a relic, nor a machine, It is a message, not for us to read, but for something else, to find, because, according to one final note, scribbled in a margin by the priest who last cleaned the chamber, it does not emit light, it reflects it. From where, I do not know. But it is watching. They call it the Quiet Palace. Castel Gandolfo, perched above the mirror of Lake Albano, is supposed to be a place of rest, a refuge, a retreat from the political storms of Rome. But those who have served within its walls know better, especially in the weeks before the equinox. It begins with the birds. They vanish. Not fly away vanish. No chirps at dawn. No shadows across the tiled courtyards. Just silence. Thick. Pressing. Even the insects stop humming. Guards assigned to the outer walls report nausea. A ringing in their ears that no doctor can explain. And always, a sense that something is moving just beyond the edge of sight. Then, on the night itself, when the day and night balance, the screaming begins. It doesn't echo through halls like a human voice would. It comes from beneath, from inside the stone, a low, dragging wail that coils through the foundation. The first time it happened, in the spring of 1962, the Papal Guard nearly evacuated the entire complex, thinking it was an earthquake. But the earth didn't move, only the sound did. That night, a priest was found unconscious in the archives. His ears were bleeding. He had clawed at the marble floor until his nails split. When they woke him, he kept repeating the same phrase. It knew my name. No record of his testimony remains. The following year, new rules were issued. No one is allowed on the lower levels of Castel Gandolfo during the spring and autumn equinoxes. No clergy, no scholars, not even security. The doors are locked, the lights are turned off, and the Pope does not sleep there during those nights. But some stories still leak. In the early 1980s, a gardener named Roberto refused to leave after sunset. He claimed he heard music low and ancient coming from the basement chapel. When he descended alone, he returned pale, shaking, unable to speak for 2 days. When he finally did, he drew a shape on the wall with charcoal. It resembled an eye inside a triangle, but twisted, the angles wrong. It was removed before dawn. In 2006, a Swiss guard standing night watch quit mid-shift and fled the compound. He would not explain why. But in a private letter to his brother later leaked, he described hearing breathing behind the garden statues, slow, measured, and not human. He never returned to service. What makes Castel Gandolfo unique is not just its history, it is what lies beneath it. An ancient temple, older than the church, built before Rome. The foundations sink into volcanic rock, riddled with catacombs and passageways no one dares map. Some say the residence was chosen not for peace, but for containment, because what lives below, if it lives at all, does not walk, it listens, and when the sun balances in the sky, when the veil between seasons thins, it remembers. That is why the priests do not speak of it, why confessions from those nights are burned before they are read, and why, every spring and autumn, a single candle is lit in the lowest chapel and left alone, not as a prayer, but as a warning. They brought it in at night, through the back corridor of the Lateran Palace. No public roads, no questions, no records, just 2 men in black cassocks and a gurney covered in lead-lined cloth. The guards were told it was a burn victim, but one of them caught a glimpse when the sheet slipped, and he never returned to duty. What they brought wasn't dead, but it wasn't fully alive either. It had no heartbeat, no visible signs of breath, yet it moved. Its eyes followed sound, its lips formed words, and not in panic or pain. It spoke, in Latin, fluent, precise, ecclesiastical Latin, the kind only taught in seminaries and buried archives. When asked its name, it responded with a phrase not heard since the time of Aquinas. I am one who fell, but was not cast. They found it in the Pyrenees, nestled in a cave sealed by a rockfall, discovered only after a landslide in 1973. exposed a passage that hadn't seen light in centuries. According to field notes from a now missing priest, the creature was curled in a fetal position, surrounded by glyphs scorched into the stone. When they approached, it opened its eyes, and it smiled. The decision to baptize it came not from the local diocese but from Rome. A secret conclave of exorcists and theologians debated for 31 hours whether it was even capable of salvation. Some argued it was a relic, others, a deceiver. But one voice, Cardinal Menicelli, insisted, "If it speaks the language of God, then we owe it the mercy of his water." The ritual was held beneath the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, in a chamber reserved for emergencies of a different kind. Only 7 men attended. The creature stood of its own will. It did not resist. But when the water touched its skin, the air grew cold. The flame of every candle flickered inward. One priest collapsed, clutching his chest. The creature placed its hand on his shoulder, and he rose, uninjured, but forever changed. He spoke no words again, only wrote, in a script no one could read. After the baptism, it said nothing more, just closed its eyes, and remained still. Tests showed no pulse, no respiration, no decay. It did not die. It simply stopped. They sealed it inside a marble tomb beneath the Vatican gardens. No name, no markings, just a slab, heavy, cold. And if you press your ear to it on certain nights, some say you can hear whispering. A single phrase, repeated, "It is not I who was saved. It is you who were warned." No public record of the ritual exists. Cardinal Menicelli vanished 6 months later during a retreat in Croatia. The other attendees were reassigned or quietly retired. But one letter survived unsent, found in a drawer years later. It read, "We baptized it out of fear, not faith. It did not come for salvation. It came to remind us, we are not the only ones who keep records." It arrived on a Thursday. The year was 2009. The place, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, nestled high on Mount Graham in Arizona. At 3 minutes past midnight, a technician monitoring the deep sky array logged an anomaly. Not a burst, not static, a song. It began as a frequency too perfect to be random, rising in clean mathematical intervals, folding inward, repeating, like a spiral echo caught in glass. Most would have dismissed it as background radiation, a natural fluctuation, but not this one, because someone at the observatory, an old Jesuit with a habit of humming while he worked, froze mid-step when he heard it. He recognized the pattern, not from science, from worship. The tones matched a harmonic buried in a medieval chant composed in the monastery of Cluny sometime in the 12th century. Gregorian, but layered, dissonant, almost waiting. The chant was rarely performed because no human voice could sustain its resonance correctly. Until now, because the signal did it, exactly, perfectly. And then, just as the Vatican's signal software began to stabilize it, something new layered on top. A voice, not quite human, not mechanical either, soft, impossible, and speaking in a language long forgotten but oddly familiar to anyone who had ever sat beneath a cathedral dome and listened with their bones instead of their ears. The recording was only 12 seconds long, but the final 3 seconds were translated by a team of linguistic theologians summoned from Rome. Using sacred phonetic reconstructions and Gregorian intonation charts, they decoded the final phrase, "We sang you into being." The implications sent a wave of panic through the scientific advisors assigned to the observatory. Protocol dictated the information be forwarded to the Secretariat of State. But before the message could be formally logged, a papal envoy arrived. The data was confiscated, the hard drives removed, all copies destroyed, except one. A backup accidentally archived on a Jesuit researcher's private device. He fled with it. He made it as far as Palermo before vanishing. His apartment was left untouched. His notes were burned. But a single page remained, buried in the binding of a psalter hidden beneath his bed. A question. What if Genesis was only the second verse? In the weeks that followed, Vatican officials denied the existence of any such signal. The observatory's schedule was revised, access restricted, and a new document was quietly circulated within the highest tiers of the Church, an addendum to the old papal bull on extraterrestrial life, written in the margins by an anonymous hand. It said, "If they sang us into being, who wrote the lyrics?" The signal has never repeated, but some say the chants have changed. Monasteries from Monte Cassino to Mount Athos report moments during Vespers where the air shifts and certain tones vibrate deeper than stone. Monks describe an overwhelming presence, melancholy, ancient, listening, as if someone, somewhere, is waiting for us to remember the melody, or worse, to finish the song. The room has no name, no key, only a passphrase known by 3 men at any given time. Hidden beneath a sub-basement of the Apostolic Palace, it is said to be accessible only through a sequence of elevators and mechanical doors that don't appear on any Vatican blueprint. There are no windows, no crucifixes, only a chill, the scent of copper, and the thing in the center. The structure stands nearly 8 feet tall, mounted on a plinth of black basalt. It is not metal, not glass, not stone. Its surface is smooth but yields no reflection, only interference, like an old television between channels. 1,000 shades of static swirl silently in its oval face. People call it a mirror, but it does not show what's in front of it. It shows what's waiting behind. It first arrived in Rome in 1928, according to a note handwritten by Cardinal Gaspari, and found decades later stuffed between pages of a ledger in the secret archives. No one knows who delivered it. Only that it was already sealed inside a marble sarcophagus when it was wheeled into the Vatican on the feast of St. Michael. The document warned, "Do not let it face the east." The first to stand before it was a young Swiss guard. He lasted 11 seconds, then collapsed, eyes wide, lips trembling. He kept repeating the same word, "observers." He was discharged, never seen again. The second witness, a theologian from Milan, stared into it for nearly 2 minutes. Later, he wrote in his journal that the static had cleared, that behind it were figures in long robes, not standing, but hanging, suspended in something not quite water, not quite air, watching, smiling. He was transferred to a Carthusian monastery in the Alps and took a vow of silence. His final letter simply read, "We are not the authors of the judgment, only the echo." Popes have visited it only rarely. One allegedly stood before it in 1953, alone. He emerged pale, hands shaking, and refused to speak of what he saw. But he canceled his visit to the United Nations the following month and ordered every seminary in Europe to revise their teachings on angels, updating the curriculum to include non-human intelligences not aligned with salvation. In 1997, Pope John Paul II reportedly ordered the door sealed after 3 separate curators claimed to see motion behind the glass figures pressing forward, not as reflection, but as emergence. All 3 men were sent to different monasteries. None were allowed to speak publicly again. One leaked a note to his sister, scribbled on the inside of a hymn book. They do not enter through it. They remember through it. Today, the vault is visited only once a year during a ritual few know exists. 3 bishops, 1 archivist, and a silent witness. They stand, they pray, they observe. And when they leave, they each place a single bead on a chain. When the chain reaches 66 beads, the ritual is said to end. It currently holds 64, and the static has begun to hum. The gathering took place behind sealed doors in a chamber older than the Sistine Chapel. Not the usual council hall, but a forgotten cloister near the Vatican Gardens, once used by the Inquisition. The date was February 2014. There were no press releases, no photographs. Only the presence of 13 carefully selected theologians, scientists, linguists, and 1 man whose name does not appear in any registry but traveled under papal authority from Buenos Aires. They were summoned to debate one question: Can something not born of Eve possess what we call a soul? The Vatican had always entertained the possibility of life beyond Earth cautiously, quietly. Jesuit astronomers had whispered such things for decades. But now, the question was no longer theoretical. Something had been found, or perhaps contacted. The details remained sealed, but one attendee, now exiled, claimed in a private letter that the evidence brought to the summit was not made of flesh, but of voice and memory. The being was not present in body, but recordings were played. Vocal emissions, if they could be called that mimicked Aramaic intonation and Latin cadence, but inverted, like a psalm sung backward. One clip reportedly said, "Your fire gave us shape, your breath, boundary. But the name we do not carry." Some in the room wept, others called it heresy. By the third day, the divide was clear. The scientists argued that personhood did not require biological familiarity, that intelligence, artificial or evolved, could still house self-awareness. One Jesuit likened it to the angels of old, beings created before time, who witnessed the foundations of the cosmos. He said, "Perhaps what we call alien is only what refused the fall." But the others disagreed, vehemently. One cardinal slammed his hand on the table and said, "If it does not descend from Adam, it cannot be redeemed." Would so Gretchen. The argument spiraled into metaphysics. Could Christ's sacrifice extend beyond earth? Was the incarnation cosmic or strictly terrestrial? Did salvation apply only to the descendants of Abraham or to any being capable of longing? A priest from Malta posed the final question. What if they never needed saving? What if we are the anomaly? That was when the lights flickered. Some say it was just a power fluctuation, a coincidence. But the meeting adjourned minutes later, and the results were never published. The room was closed, its records sealed, its participants bound to silence. Several were reassigned. One vanished en route to Cairo. Another was later found in a monastery in Norway, scribbling equations on the walls with charcoal and humming what sounded like an ancient hymn in a language no one could name. The Vatican offered no comment, but 6 months later, a new internal directive was issued. No clergy shall participate in non-terrestrial communion, regardless of linguistic consent or mimetic intelligence. It was never explained, because the debate is over, not by decision, but by decree. It was winter in the late 1940s, when a team of Vatican-sanctioned archaeologists arrived in Jerusalem under the pretense of restoring ancient mosaics near the Western Wall. But their true destination lay beneath the surface, far below the layers of empire, blood, and stone. A forgotten chamber, rumored to have existed since the time of Solomon, had been pinpointed using old Templar maps and cryptic scrolls preserved only in the apostolic archives. They descended under cover of night, moving past damp catacombs and shattered cisterns until they found it, a sealed chamber carved in geometric precision. No doors, no markings, only a vibration, like a slow heartbeat in the stone. It took them 7 days to open it. Inside, the air was dry and unnaturally cold. At the center of the room, resting on a stone pedestal, was a cube no larger than a bread loaf, black as obsidian, yet matte and without reflection. Its surface shimmered faintly when approached, as if responding to body heat or breath. When one priest reached to touch it, he collapsed, whispering fragments of Genesis in reverse. The cube emitted sound, not noise, not a hum, a sequence, tonal patterns that resembled ancient liturgical chants but wrong, inverted, as though sung by something that knew the words but not the meaning. It pulsed in slow intervals, sometimes silent for hours, then suddenly singing. Etched into its surface were inscriptions. Some were unmistakably Hebrew, though older than any scroll found in Qumran. But among the lines were symbols that defied translation, resembling cuneiform shattered and reassembled by something that didn't need language. The Vatican team sealed the chamber and transported the object by diplomatic crate to Rome. It arrived at Castel Gandolfo under armed guard, where it was placed in a radiation-shielded vault beneath the observatory. A Jesuit linguist assigned to decode the markings vanished 3 weeks later. His notes were never recovered, only a single line scratched into his bedroom mirror. It is not a relic, it is a reply. The Church refused to classify it as divine, nor demonic, only inconclusive. But one researcher, a Carmelite scholar fluent in biblical Hebrew, claimed the central inscription could be loosely read as, "We watched your temple fall. We wept before you did." Another phrase, translated using an artificial intelligence program decades later, rendered a chilling alternate line. "You were not the first to build here." In the decades since, the cube has been kept silent, encased in a triple-layer Faraday cage, and moved twice due to unexplained magnetic interference during Holy Week. Its presence is known only to 6 men, and one of them reportedly requested last rites after hearing it speak during what should have been silence. There is no official record of the object, no mention in church doctrine, but in a Vatican journal from 1952, handwritten in the margins of a report labeled Jur 13, one note remains. "This box remembers, and it is waiting for someone to remember with it." He began to wake in the middle of the night, always at the same time, 3:23 in the morning. Not from nightmares, not from pain, but from something deeper, something threaded into the silence of his private chambers. Pope Benedict, a man known for his intellect and rigid discipline, at first attributed it to fatigue or stress. Yet the pattern persisted, always the same hour, always the same phrase, spoken in a voice not his own. The first time it came, it was faint, just a whisper through the stone walls. A single sentence, ancient and familiar, though he could not place it. On the second night, he realized it was not Latin, nor Greek. It was older, Aramaic, precise and unwavering. The voice did not echo. It did not falter. It simply spoke, as though the marble itself had breath. The papal residence was swept for surveillance. Technicians found nothing, no wires, no speakers, no entry points. And yet, on the 5th night, the voice returned. It began listing numbers, long, rhythmic, deliberate, not random sequences, celestial coordinates. When charted, they pointed to a patch of sky near the Taurus constellation, and then, farther, well beyond the edge of known maps. The Vatican Observatory confirmed the readings with reluctance. That region of space had no known star systems at those vectors, but Benedict pressed them for answers. A Jesuit astronomer, summoned in secrecy, reviewed the data and returned with a single word: impossible. The voice began to change, not in tone but in intent. It started reciting psalms, then distorting them, injecting foreign lines as though rewriting scripture mid-verse, and always in that same unbroken Aramaic. By the 12th night, Benedict stopped sleeping in the papal apartments. He ordered the tapestries removed, the walls scraped, the bed dismantled. The voice continued. He spoke to no one about it at first. Only after he fainted in the Apostolic Palace Library did a letter appear unsigned, left on his personal kneeler. It simply read, "Others have heard it too, but only you have understood it." The Swiss Guard reported strange power fluctuations near his quarters. Lights would dim for 3 seconds, always 3. Never more, never less. Security footage during those windows showed static, not blackness, static. An audio technician attempting to isolate the sound suffered a seizure. His final report, found scrawled in the margins of his Vatican passbook, read, "It knows I am listening. He's not O's of Praf," and feigned. Pope Benedict resigned officially on the 11th of February, 2013. He said it was due to his age and declining strength, but those closest to him noticed something different in his eyes. Not fear, not sadness, something more ancient, something surrendered. In the days before his resignation, a final message was recorded in his handwriting and sealed in the secret archive. It was never published. But one line, leaked by a translator who later vanished during a pilgrimage to Mount Ararat, is now whispered among the more esoteric clergy. They do not come to be worshipped, they come to be remembered, and they are older than the stars. There are catacombs beneath the Vatican that no one speaks of, not the ones tourists wander with candles and gasping reverence, but older ones, deeper, carved when Rome was still whispering its first prayers into stone. Beneath the known tombs and the gilded bones of saints lies a level marked by absence. No blueprints, no tours, no permission slips. Only a series of vaults hidden beneath the substructure of St. Peter's Basilica, buried in layers that predate the church itself. It was in the 1930s, during Mussolini's agreement with the Vatican to excavate parts of the necropolis, that workers struck something they weren't meant to find. Not Christian, not Roman. Something else. The report was brief, its final page torn away. All that survived was a mention of a chamber sealed in volcanic stone. At its center, an object that did not belong. A sarcophagus, they called it. But no one agreed on what it looked like. One described it as black glass. Another said it was covered in carvings that shimmered when viewed sideways. And yet another, an older priest turned archivist, claimed it was wrapped in something not quite metal, not quite skin. The markings on the surface weren't Latin, not Greek. They were traced to Sumerian cuneiform, not just the language of ancient Mesopotamia, but one of the oldest written languages on earth. The translation was partial. The first line read, "Beneath the stone lies silence." The next, "Do not awaken what remembers before breath." "I mud?" They sealed it again. Decades passed. Then came the whispers from the guards assigned near the vault's location, rumors of low vibrations felt in the stone during full moons. Not earthquakes, not machinery. A hum, like distant chanting beneath one's feet. One guard swore the floor grew warm for precisely 12 minutes at midnight. He was transferred to Malta the next day. A technician, part of a short-lived attempt to digitize underground air pressure readings, noted fluctuations near the sealed chamber every 29 days. The same lunar interval. No gas leaks. No pipes. Just a pulse. Subtle, but unmistakably rhythmic. Like something alive was keeping time. The cuneiform warnings were re-examined in the 1970s by a linguist whose notes have since been redacted. But a margin scrawl remained. It's not a coffin, it's a lock. In 2006, an anonymous letter was delivered to the Apostolic Penitentiary. It contained a sketch of the sarcophagus and a single line. "It dreams in our calendar. No one speaks of it now. But every full moon, in a vault beneath the holiest site in Catholicism, an ancient box still waits. Older than Peter, older than Rome, older, some say, than the idea of God itself. And when the pulse comes, it is not the ground that shudders. It is the silence that listens back." It was sometime after midnight when the old security guard made his final call. He spoke slowly, like someone narrating a dream he wasn't sure was over. 4 figures had entered St. Peter's Basilica, he said. Pale, silent, barefoot. They did not speak. They did not gesture. They simply moved one behind the other down the center aisle beneath the dome, toward the altar, toward the tomb that marked the supposed resting place of the first bishop of Rome. The guard's name was Enrico, a veteran of nearly 3 decades in Vatican service. He was known for his punctuality, his faith, and his quiet, methodical way of documenting everything, every incident, every anomaly. But what he wrote that night was different. His handwritten log entry stopped mid-sentence. The pen trailed off the page, like his attention had been pulled violently elsewhere. What followed wasn't logged in any official record, only whispered by the junior guards who found him, collapsed in the security control room with his eyes wide open, lips parted in shock. The screens had gone to static. All of them, every camera inside the basilica, the feed restored at exactly 3:03 in the morning. By then, Enrico was gone. The autopsy listed heart failure, a common end for an uncommon night. The report he filed, what little he had time to write, was sealed the same day by order of the prefecture of the papal household. When questioned, Vatican press officials dismissed the incident as routine maintenance disruption and a personal medical event. But the guards knew better. One of them, years later, would describe what he saw on the playback system just before the feed was wiped. A flicker of light, not from the church's chandeliers, not from the altar, but from the entrance. A shimmer, almost liquid, and then the outline of 4 shadows stepping through, where no door had opened. They were not dressed in robes, not clothed at all, at least not in the way we understand fabric. Their skin reflected the gold of the mosaics above them. Their heads moved in perfect synchrony, tilted ever so slightly toward the marble dome overhead, as if listening to something coming from inside it. One stopped at the baptismal font. Another knelt where pilgrims light candles. And then, all at once, they vanished from the screen. The church never acknowledged the event publicly. But 2 months later, a new security protocol was enacted. Mandatory overnight pairing, rotating patrols, and most notably, cameras inside St. Peter's Basilica would now include a 2-minute backup delay in case of interference. What were they? No one knows, or no one says. Some whispered it was a vision, a warning. Others called it a visitation. But Enrico's final scribbled line, found beneath his fallen chair, said only this: they were not ghosts, they were waiting. He had spent a lifetime translating fear into theology. Father Corrado Balducci, respected demonologist, diplomat, and unofficial voice of the Vatican on the unexplainable, had spoken calmly in public, always cautious, always composed. He walked the line between the spiritual and the scientific like a man who knew the terrain too well. But in private, near the end, his certainty began to break. His voice, once so firm, trembled during his final interviews. And just days before his death in the summer of the early 2000s, he requested one final conversation, not with a priest, with an astronomer. The man he summoned was a former Jesuit colleague who had left the Vatican Observatory years earlier under ambiguous circumstances. The details of their meeting remain unrecorded, save for a single audio tape that surfaced years later, an unmarked cassette mailed to an independent researcher in Turin. The voice is weak, but unmistakable. It's Balducci, the last tape, his last confession. He begins with silence, then breathing, and then, they were never fallen angels. They were waiting. The tape continues for nearly 9 minutes. The phrases are cryptic, occasionally slurred. He speaks of stars that do not move, of vibrations like speech but with no words, of intelligences that exist outside time. He mentions Fatima, but not the miracle. He mentions something buried beneath the hill, a frequency only certain ears can hear. And then he says this: the error was thinking they had fallen, but they didn't fall. They descended. Those closest to Balducci noted his increasing concern with the convergence of celestial events. He became obsessed with radio transmissions from the Kepler region, particularly one sequence in 2002 that mimicked a pattern he claimed to have seen in a 15th century Gregorian chant. He believed the stars were not only inhabited but aware of us, and waiting for some predetermined moment to reveal themselves, not through contact, but resonance, through something that could not be understood with instruments, but only with what he called spiritual geometry. In his last sermon, never delivered but typed and stored on his personal typewriter, he wrote, "We have mistaken angels for demons, and demons for metaphor. But neither metaphor nor myth explains the silence that stares back through the telescope." He died alone in his study. No autopsy was ordered, but the colleague who discovered his body described the expression on his face as unsettlingly peaceful, as if he had seen something just before the end, or finally understood something that had haunted him for decades. The cassette tape was tested. No edits, no splices. It ends with static, and one final sentence, almost whispered, nearly lost in the noise. They never left. They only waited for us to notice. The papal ring is a symbol of power, of lineage, of divine continuity. Worn by each pontiff and destroyed upon his death, it is said to be a seal of heavenly authority. But what if it opens more than just letters? What if it is not merely ceremonial but a key? A story whispered among those closest to the apostolic palace speaks of a room beneath the apostolic archives, deeper even than the rumored Hall of Tears. A chamber with no official entry, no map, no code, only the ring. According to a sealed testimony by a former archivist never meant to leave the Vatican walls, the ring does not function mechanically. It activates something. A panel behind a false reliquary near the chapel of St. Sylvester. The mechanism recognizes the specific blend of metals, the curvature, the imprint of the current pontiff's pulse. And when the seal aligns, the wall exhales. Inside is not gold, not frescoes, not even light. The chamber is bare, save for a single altar and a narrow plinth. On it lies a series of bound manuscripts, dozens, some impossibly old. Their bindings are blackened leather, their pages impossibly thin. Each marked, not by date, but by symbol, a spiral, a twin sun, an eye made of intersecting stars. According to the testimony, the records begin not in the Christian era, but during the reign of Constantine. The first volume tells of a visitor from the firmament who descended in a sphere of fire that did not burn. Constantine, it says, received this being in secret, mistaking it for an angel. The visitor did not deny it. Subsequent volumes chart appearances at irregular intervals, some separated by centuries, others arriving in rapid succession during times of upheaval. One volume, dated roughly to the year 1080, details a chorus of light hovering above the Lateran Basilica. Another, from the year 1633, speaks of a glass coffin discovered beneath the catacombs, containing what the writer calls an emissary, neither dead nor sleeping. But the most recent entries, those written in a trembling hand during the late 1970s and early 1980s, are what disturbed the archivist most. They speak not of appearances, but of messages. Specific ones, a sequence of locations, star coordinates, warnings. A passage translated from the year 1979 reads, "They await our signal. If none is given, they will assume refusal. If refusal is confirmed, they will return not as angels, but as witnesses. Any was men. Compredi. Witnesses to what?" The archivist's letter ends abruptly. The last page is stained, the ink blurred, as if written in haste. It reads simply, "He has seen it. The new Pope. He knows." When Pope John Paul II was asked in private about the existence of alien life, he smiled and said, "The universe is vast, and God's imagination vaster still." But when pressed again, this time behind closed doors, he reportedly turned away and whispered, "Some rooms should remain closed, even in heaven." To this day, no pontiff has ever spoken publicly about the chamber. The ring is passed, the room stays silent, but the door remembers. There are whispers in the archives, texts catalogued in ink that never fades, penned by hands long returned to dust. They are not listed in any public index, and they are never loaned, not even to cardinals. They sit bound in silence behind glass treated to darken in the presence of heat, and within them, a forgotten classification of celestial order, the 10th choir. Traditionally, there are said to be 9 choirs of angels, seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, and angels, each layered in its hierarchy, each devoted to an aspect of the divine, but buried deep in a bundle of apocryphal manuscripts labeled De Secretis Vox Dei. A 10th is described, one without a name, only a sound. The Vatican's classification is redacted, but an anonymous theologian once recorded its title in a private margin, Memorat, the Rememberers. They were not cast down like Lucifer. They did not war against the divine. They did not hunger for thrones or crowns. They were exiled for speaking, for remembering something so primordial, so destabilizing, that even heaven shuddered its ears. A page in Latin reads, "They knew the shape of the first silence. They watched when the word was formed not from sound but from subtraction." In the late 1920s, a Jesuit scholar working in the archives reported hearing a tone low, harmonic, impossible to trace. It vibrated the air like breath through crystal. The sound, he claimed, came not from the stone halls or ancient tomes, but from within his own chest. He wrote that it did not hurt. It clarified, as if his bones were being tuned. He called it vox decima, the voice of the 10th. He was reassigned within the month. His name was never spoken again. There is speculation never confirmed that Pope Paul VI once consulted the secret texts after a personal audience with an astronomer from the Arizona Observatory. The astronomer had described a rhythmic radio signal received from deep space, one that matched an ancient Gregorian cadence once used only during exorcisms. But the final harmonic in the sequence did not exist in any known musical scale. It did, however, match the tone notated in the De Secretis Vox Dei manuscript. Some believe the 10th choir was not a choir at all, not celestial, not demonic, but something else. A memory baked into the structure of existence, locked behind the curtain of creation. And every now and then, through accident, experiment, or prayer, we hear it. One page, translated by a defrocked Benedictine monk before his disappearance in 1993, closes with this: "They did not fall. They were folded, bent into the corners of time like unwanted dreams. But they are not silent. They are waiting to be remembered." The Vatican denies any record of such texts, but the tone returns every few years. A Vatican guard once said that the sound made him forget his name for 3 whole days. Another whispered that the voice doesn't speak to the ears, it speaks to the bones, and when it does, it doesn't say a word. It simply reminds. In the restricted wing of the Apostolic Library, where even cardinals need written clearance and digital devices are forbidden beyond a triple-locked iron gate, there lies a scroll so old its casing crumbles when touched. It is not listed in any official index. The scroll has no title, only a faded strip of linen binding it closed, marked with one symbol 3 concentric circles, intersected by a single diagonal slash. The scroll was discovered during the restoration of a collapsed wall in the Vatican crypts in the late 19th century. Behind a hollow stone cavity, among shattered bones and a rusted silver cross, it lay untouched. Radiocarbon analysis would later suggest the parchment itself was no older than the 12th century, but the ink was far stranger. Not iron gall, not ash, something darker, something the lab refused to categorize. The scroll was partially unrolled by a Benedictine scribe fluent in Latin, Aramaic, and an obscure dialect of medieval Occitan. The language written on the scroll matched none of them, yet the translator reported understanding it perfectly, as if the meaning bypassed language altogether. The first half of the scroll describes a visitation, not by angels, not by saints, but by something called the Witness without time. It arrived without sound, casting no shadow. It did not speak aloud. Its words were said to pour into the minds of monks like wine, spilled across a stone floor impossible to gather back up. The scroll's scribe claimed it taught them things, not prophecy, not doctrine, geometry, frequencies, patterns older than the stars, descriptions of cities not yet built, skies not yet mapped, and a war that had no beginning, only echoes. But then, just past the midpoint of the scroll, the script begins to change. The glyphs stretch, the margins widen. Letters bend unnaturally, as if the hand that wrote them trembled in unnatural ways. And then nothing. The line stops mid-sentence. There are no smudges, no signs of interruption, but directly beneath the final unfinished mark is something no historian, no theologian, no archivist has ever explained. A fingerprint, pressed deep into the parchment, preserved like fossilized glass, elongated, nearly twice the length of a human index finger, and with 3 knuckle joints. The ridges do not match human dermatoglyphics. They are too perfect, too symmetrical, as if carved, not grown. Vatican archivists made rubbings, but they were later destroyed. The original print is kept sealed under triple-paned glass in a humidity-controlled chamber. Several attempts have been made to complete the scroll's final sentence using linguistic forensics and AI pattern prediction. None have succeeded. The closest reconstruction stopped at the phrase, "When the final silence comes, remember that we," and then, garbled nonsense. But the fingerprint remains. One Vatican scribe who briefly handled the scroll claimed to hear a low hum whenever he entered the chamber afterward, not sound exactly more like pressure, as if something beneath the floor was breathing, watching. He later joined a silent order and never spoke again. To this day, the scroll is referred to only by its unofficial name, Finis Tacitum, the end that does not speak. They say the walls of the Vatican have heard everything, but there is one room whose silence is not from secrecy but reverence. Every new pontiff, freshly sworn in beneath the sunlit dome of St. Peter's, is led there once the crowds disperse and the robes have settled. No ceremony, no witnesses. Just a narrow corridor beneath the apostolic palace and a key passed from hand to trembling hand. The room is plain. 1 table, 1 chair, 1 book. The door seals behind him. No guards remain. The book has no title. Its cover is worn, like it has passed through centuries of hands that never stopped shaking. Some say the binding is not leather. Some say it is older than any animal ever named. The pages are yellowed, yet soft, never brittle. The ink never fades. Within those pages are records, not doctrine, not theology, encounters. The first chapter does not begin with Genesis. It begins with a description of lights in the sky, seen by shepherds in the desert during the reign of a forgotten empire. The same pattern of lights was recorded again during the Council of Nicaea, then again during the sack of Rome, and again beneath Hiroshima's shadow. The book holds photographs, even before cameras were invented, drawings that predate telescopes yet accurately depict the surface of Saturn's moons. There are reports in Latin, French, German, and languages no pope has ever spoken, yet somehow all have understood. It tells of beings who walk like men but cast no shadow, of shapes that descend and leave no mark on the earth, of messages whispered through the mouths of children too young to lie. The final chapters are more unsettling. They speak not just of visitors but of agreements, moments when contact was made, not through violence or wonder, but through compromise. One pope in the late 19th century refused to turn the final page. He died 3 weeks later, lungs full of water, though he had not drowned. Another wept openly for days, then rewrote key parts of canon law. But the decision, the true decision, comes not from what is read. It comes after. A second key waits beneath the table. It opens a second door. No one knows where it leads. Some popes never use it. They walk out pale, lips sealed forever. And the church continues, unchanged in the eyes of the world. Others do. And something shifts, a subtle change in policy, a new initiative in the sciences, a sudden silence on old doctrine, or a resignation, sudden and unexplained. What the Pope really knows is not written in gold leaf or carved in marble. It is hidden in that book. And in the look he gives the stars from the balcony that first night when the cameras flash and the world watches, never realizing how much is being held back behind his eyes. Because it was never just faith he inherited. It was the burden of knowing we are not alone, and never have been.